Hello and welcome to another A-Tippling Philosopher video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. I'm going to talk you through the front lines and then do some strategic conversation and add in some nuggets. There's quite a lot to talk about, as there is every single day. It's such a dynamic war, this thing, with so many geopolitical variables going on, considering it's involving basically the entire world. So it's unsurprising. And when you've got Putin declaring that 4 of these regions are now part of Russia, there's obviously going to be a lot to talk about, but I'll go straight to the front lines, and I'm going to go straight to the Lyman front line, because essentially, very quickly, not a lot has taken place up north in the Kupiansk area. Okay, there doesn't seem to be a lot of movement up there, down this Oskil River. Not a lot of movement until you get to Lyman, when there is a bit of movement, and there's not a lot of movement anywhere else, even if there is obviously intense fighting going on. So when I say there's not a lot going on, there is a lot going on, but there's just not a territorial gain on either side. Okay, so that's that. Here's the War Mapper map of the region that we've been concentrating on a lot recently, the Lyman region, with this pocket of Russian resistance and a very narrow neck here. And the Ukrainians making advances towards the Oskil River. They haven't really made too much advance up north, a little bit along the railway line and along the Oskil River. But generally, they've stopped making the northern advances to concentrate on this Lyman area. And I will now zoom into my own maps. So this is the map I gave you 2 days ago, maybe 3 days ago now. This is when the net started closing, the sort of closing bag of this pocket, as some people might say. And we had Chandri-Lohove and Drobisheve being particularly difficult to overcome. And this neck started getting sort of thinner and thinner. This was the day after, so there's a move toward Pidliman and a bit further north, and then that kind of stopped. So this is that movement around the Oskil I was sort of mentioning. That has generally stopped, as we have the Ukrainians have concentrated on closing this bag. Okay, then this is what happened yesterday. The further movement is in this sort of lilac purple, I suppose. They have moved up to the Oskil River. And they have taken they had taken Chandri-Lohove yesterday, and now they've taken Drobisheve. So actually, that's 2 days worth of movement in there. They had taken Chandri-Lohove yesterday. So here's the evidence of Drobisheve being taken. Here are a bunch of troops in Drobisheve, saying, hey, we've taken over Drobisheve. But, I mean, just look behind. This is a sort of... It's not like you take a village or a town back and it's like, okay, guys, you can move back in. On the war zone, these places are just destroyed. People going to their houses will be going back often to rubble and stuff that they can't move into. It's pretty depressing stuff. So this was... The red line was 2 days ago. This is zoomed in slightly further. 2 days ago, so as you can see, Chandri-Lohove was holding out, and Drobisheve, and then yesterday this was lost or liberated, this area, and we had Ukrainians moving in and closing in and around Yampil. So they took the Yampil yesterday and were able to move up through this forested area to properly enclose Lyman. And today, this is what it looks like. So right around Lyman, the Ukrainians have effectively surrounded. Drobisheve has been liberated, and the Ukrainians have moved right up to the Oskil on the western bank. So really, you've got Torske and Zarechne being held by the 201st Military Camp. There's a bunch of Russian soldiers in there, not your top Russian soldiers, to be fair, but they're holding out here. And then you've got a number of different sort of units, as far as I can work out, in Lyman. Now, the question is, because they're being reinforced at the moment by various forces, and there's evidence to say mobilized troops are now making it to this front line in ever increasing numbers. So there is this movement of forces. However, they are under attack here, and that means it's quite dangerous to try and push back through here. So the question is: are the Russians trying to reinforce in order to keep Lyman, or are they trying to force a safer corridor through here so that the troops in Lyman can retreat? There is evidence to suggest these guys are preparing to make a push back through here. But obviously, these things are difficult when, especially since this is pretty much wooded area here, when you can just fire out of here and cause all sorts of trouble. That you also have special forces operating across these lakes here, and they're operating on sort of 4-wheel drives with pieces of kit that things like Stugner anti-tank rockets, so they can rock up, have a pop, and then shoot back. Terni was liberated, I believe, yesterday, and then it's now back in Russian hands. So things are happening across these lakes. But as I said, special forces have been in operation into really effective ways right over the course of the whole conflict. So especially when there's a lot of tree cover around, it's much harder down in, say, the Kherson area, which is completely flat and lacking in places to hide. There are no sort of forests particularly, whereas when there's a lot of forested areas, you can push out these forested areas, set up an anti-tank Stugner or something, hit some tank, blow it up, and then pack up and scoot back into the forest. It's a bit like shoot and scoot. You rush out, take something out, and then rush back, and then you can't be found. It's really difficult. So special forces operating here means that you have fire control over this road from this forested side here, but you've also got special forces operating from this side, so you are effectively watching out from both sides. Anyway, this is imminent. What's happening here, it seems. The question is how many reinforcements can be supplied from the east by the Russians, and at the same time, what the intentions are. Is it to supply the Lyman troops with a view to holding Lyman, or is it a case of facilitating their exfiltration from Lyman out, thus closing up this pocket? And I would think surely their days are numbered as far as holding Lyman, and you would, when you're surrounded like this. But then the question is the mobilization going to produce such a significant number of people that somewhere like this can be taken back? So there's been some interesting statistics going on. Somebody has extrapolated that given St. Petersburg has been mobilizing this number of troops, like 8,000 in this particular area, if you extrapolate that across the country, that works out to something like 1 to 1.5 million people. So it's not just this 300,000 if you're doing an extrapolation of certain numbers. It looks like there could be a shed load of people coming. Now, even if they are really, I keep talking about this, but even if they are really poorly equipped with obsolete or even in some cases non-existent larger materiel, then they are still boots on the ground. They are still people that can force a Pyrrhic victory. Even if a huge amount of them aren't particularly high in morale, if you're going to send, let's use this as an example, if you're going to send 10,000 troops, as poorly equipped as they might be, in through here, then suddenly the whole dynamic here, the calculation becomes entirely different. If you've got 3,000 Ukrainians fairly well equipped, squeezing Lyman, and suddenly 10, 15,000 Russians are pouring in here, everything changes. And that's a calculation. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know how successful the mobilization will be in getting troops to these particular areas in a given time frame. But it certainly has a potential to completely change this conflict. So there you go. That's why Ukraine really needed to have taken as much territory as possible in as short a time as possible. And people who are slightly more critical might, wonder that, hey, do you know what? They really haven't. Yes, they've taken this area, but could they have pushed on and taken the entire area up to Svatove and down this river from Kremina to Svatove? that would have been obviously ideal, because you're cutting off a logistical hub, and even Starobilsk would have been an amazing objective, but that's obviously a little too far for the time frame we're talking about. But essentially, Ukraine could be in trouble here. This mobilization could be, I don't know if game changer. Yeah, it could be a game changer. It just depends how effectively they are used. So we carry on going down this front line, right? There has been not too much around Bakhmut, actually, but a bit further north of Bakhmut and certainly further south and New York, like I talked about yesterday, and other areas down here have been, there have been consistent Russian attacks, particularly from the Wagner mercenaries. And you can imagine if this was reinforced with 200,000 troops, those kind of attacks would look significantly different. Okay, and you could see a push. So perhaps Putin and the Russian generals are thinking, do you know what, the tide will turn when we pack these fronts with an absolute bucket load of troops. Now, on the flip side, Ukraine are getting a load of equipment. There's been a massive bunch of aid signed off from the US over the last couple of days, over well over $1 billion again. There have been promises of, so they're looking to get NASAMS and IRIS from Germany, which are these surface-to-air missile defense systems. They've also been promised a load more HIMARS, but the problem is, I mean, it's not just HIMARS, it's about HIMARS rockets. They're going to get them as well. But the problem is, I was reading in one place that actually those HIMARS are not from existing stocks. So it looks like they might have to be built, which means to say those extra HIMARS are going to get is within a 2-year time frame, which doesn't really help right now. If they're not being provided from existing stocks, then that is a bit of a problem. Okay, Zaporizhzhia. Yesterday, something terrible happened just when Russia was having a party in Moscow, and a whole load of residents were pulled out to fly flags and have an open air concert in support of this. I mean, goodness me, that's morally abhorrent, in my opinion, that you can invade another country, put your flag down in 4 regions, have a bunch of sham referenda, and then announce that all these places want to stay in Russia, even though you've broken every single electoral rule under the sun, a democratic electoral rule. Announce that these are all going to be part of Russia, and then have a party in Moscow to celebrate that. That is so distasteful. It's terrible. But at exactly the same time, the Russians bombed a civilian convoy in Zaporizhzhia. So now there's over 30 people have been known to die. Cars were mainly families heading towards a checkpoint, an occupied part of the region. So they were going to pick up sort of family members, whole convoy of people, completely civilian, and they were taken out by Russian rockets. And it was absolutely disgusting. The full toll of the massacre is now known. I mean, this was yesterday. 30 dead, including 14 and 10-year-old children. 118 people were injured in a blast on the civilian convoy, taking food and medicines to the people in the occupied part of the region. I mean, absolutely disgusting. That is a war crime, okay? That is a war crime, pure and simple. And yet, at the same time, the Russians were having some kind of party in Moscow where, you know, here they are celebrating the annexation of these 4 regions. It's just, okay. You wonder how many of these people were, you know, pulled out by the Russian authorities. But there's an awful lot of flag waving. Everyone seems fairly happy, and there's a lot of ultra nationalists there, you know, brought in by the coachload, singing and happiness. It's disgusting, in my opinion. As a result of this annexation, the US and the EU, and I think the UK as well, have announced a whole bunch of extra sanctions. And I think we're getting to the point where the sanctions are starting to bite, and these sanctions are covering a shed load of people around the edges. I think up to 900 extra people are going to be, you know, the rich and powerful and the elite are going to be affected. And as soon as they become disillusioned with the whole thing because, hey, their money and their lives are being affected, then they put extra pressure on the Russian authorities. Here is a convoy. I think leaving. This is that road in. Let me find you here along this road here. There's evidence that the convoys were leaving, attempting to leave, and that would have been prime target for the Russians. So Ukrainian war correspondent Yuri Butsov says that the Russian column is about to try its luck fleeing Ukrainian encirclement in Lyman. The road out of Zarichne is monitored by Ukrainians and in range. Column of military and stolen civilian vehicles. Photo just done over an hour ago. That was actually yesterday. But there's evidence now. It could be that whole Lyman area is actually going to be reinforced. We shall see. Spoke to Ukrainians from Kherson, Melitopol, Tomak, who were abducted by gunmen jailed in solitary and beaten for refusing to vote in the referendum on Russia annexing their towns. So this is the referendum that they're all singing about here. How wonderful! And the people who actually voted in it were having to vote at gunpoint after being beaten up and whacked in solitary confinement in jail. Among them is a 70-year-old woman. They fear conscription will start next week. So this is not just about annexing these areas for Russia to claim that this is now under full Russian control, and this is the territorial integrity, to quote Putin, of this area will now be maintained, and if it's threatened, Russia can retaliate in kind, and that might include nuclear. But this is also about, and I talked about this yesterday, about getting data on people who were being polled such that they know who and where the military age, the fighting age Russian men or occupied men are. So this is about doing that information gathering to say, okay, and the next step is conscripting you all into the army. So gathering all these people up that have just voted, the ones that are in the right demographics, and sending them to the front line. And this is what people are worried about. They fear that conscription will start next week. Here is a Russian. I mean, this is fascinating. So if we want to talk about nuclear war, this is well worth watching because it's just fascinating. Imagine having this conversation, seeing this conversation on your television about your nation now, whether you're in America, France, the UK, wherever you're listening to me talk about this. Imagine this was on your TV last night.
Максим Анатольевич, в вчерашней программе нашей вас не было, но Ваня вас как раз цитировал, насколько я понимаю, до сих пор последняя запись в вашем телеграм-канале, где вы сравнили диверсии против Северного потока с выстрелами в Сараево. И потом у вас, по-моему, такая фраза, если я не перевираю, теперь обратного пути нет ни у кого. Вот как-то так вы написали. Не могли бы вы пояснить, почему?
Ну просто в воронку нас всех засасывает, и я не вижу вот ни одного реалистического сценария, как мы можем выбраться. Вот пока не вижу. Может, кто-то подскажет. Поэтому я согласен с вами, Андрей, но надо жить нормально. Последние дни и недели, возможно, нам отведены. Их надо...
I don't know how we're going to get out of this. We should live our final days. Perhaps that's all we've got left. I'm just going to play that bit again.
Весело, потому что будет обидно. Да, жить, проживать в пессимизме.
Обидно, не обидно, это в таком случае будет не очень
тогда
понятно.
Порадуемся.
Нет, вот все-таки, почему вы не видите никакого возможного варианта снижения вот этой напряженности?
Я не очень
почему
понимаю,
нет
как это может произойти, потому что я, на самом деле, что касается наших... Ой, да.
He said, basically saying, we can't solve this with diplomacy. It ain't going to happen. I haven't entertained any illusions about this for a long time. This is nuclear war. It's going to happen. We need to prepare for this for being our final days.
Что касается нас, я иллюзий давно уже не питаю. Но вот по поводу западников у меня были какие-то иллюзии, что они лучше, все-таки окажутся лучше психологи, чем вот сейчас выясняется, что они как-то у них чувство самосохранения, меньше азарта такого, вот охотничьего азарта.
Of course, he's blaming the West here. Oh, the West should have been better psychologists. They should have predicted that it would have got to this and made better decisions. So, they'd have a better sense of self-preservation. So he's blaming the West, but he still thinks there's going to be a nuclear apocalypse.
Нет, они пытаются сейчас нас добить, видя наши проблемы, какие есть на Украине. Они думают, что ядерная держава может потерпеть поражение, что болезненно раненый медведь уползет в берлогу и там вот тихонечко сдохнет.
Ну, то есть вы,
медведь, у
вы
которого
совершенно
ядерные
не
ракеты, не может
сомневаетесь, я понял,
тихонечко
вы
сдохнуть.
совершенно не сомневаетесь в том, что
будет вот
дойдет
так.
вот до этого.
Да.
То есть некое
Много
обострение, которое возможно, оно, ну, я не знаю, не будет в
Неминуемо.
виде локальных
Да.
конфликтов, там, я не знаю, каких-то там экономических там мер воздействия, а будет только вот такое.
У меня есть тень сомнения, вот единственное, вот на что можно надеяться, что обе стороны доводят вот до точки кипения, чтобы потом остановиться и уже своей общественности представить это, вот уже напугать ее, сказать, ну, иначе ядерный апокалипсис. А нет, так давайте идти на какие-то условия.
So that's really interesting. So he's saying the only way we can stop this is getting to the brink, both sides getting to the brink, and then take it to their people and say, are you really scared? Let's have some concessions. The people aren't making concessions here. It's Putin. Like, it's a really interesting reflection of the thought processes of a lot of these sort of people. And again, is this all part of the agenda? We talked about whether these sort of people on these programs are throwing out every single opinion to see where it lands with the public, and then the Russian authorities can gauge what the public think from what these people are saying. So this might be very tailored, but it's just fascinating to think. Right, they're talking about the nuclear end of basically their own existence, and then saying, one, that it's the West's fault, and two, we should maybe, the only way to stop this is getting to the edge and then putting it to the people and seeing how scared they are and saying, do you want to make concessions? When Putin doesn't put anything to the people and just does what he wants, and there's nothing to do with what the people want. The latest polling in Russia has most people wanting the war to stop, but yet you don't see that happening because it's not put to the people to make those concessions. I mean, so anyway, that's really interesting. Some evidence of further derailing in this may or may not be sabotage, but it wouldn't be surprising if it is sabotage. So another train being derailed in Siberia. And again, if this is carrying mobilized troops, there could be even further reason to delay that by sabotage. There you go. The mayor of Dnipro has put out an urgent appeal for buses, as most of the city's stock was destroyed in Russia's attack on the city overnight. That's not last night, the night before. They made this video showing the extent of the damage. So this is, I talked about how Russia are only now starting to be a little bit more strategic in how they're hitting places. So they took out an airport in Kryvyi Rih. They're hitting Zaporizhzhia. They're hitting, they're much more likely to be hitting electricity substations and energy infrastructure. They're even doing that in Kharkiv. So where they can't reach Kharkiv now with artillery, they are still hitting it with the old cruise missile, and they are taking out things like electricity substations. Well, that's far more sensible than the kind of almost random hits on civilian infrastructure that they were doing before. Well, this is transport infrastructure and so virtually every single bus in that Dnipro, I mean, if that was the main, bus holding station, then all their buses are taken out, and massive destruction. And so they're calling out for buses. The city stock was destroyed, all of them. I mean, that's pretty terrifying. Again, I didn't really talk about Kherson, but Kherson, there's not a lot of movement in Kherson. But good news here in terms of, obviously, human loss is terrible of anyone, but good news as far as what's going on strategically is that the first deputy head of the region for Russia has been liquidated, which means that he's been taken out. So there you go, killed by partisans, and that is the sort of thing that the Russians don't like happening, obviously, because it affects their command structure, and their command structure is already pretty dodgy at the best of times. I want to read you this thread. Really fascinating insight from a personal point of view in terms of what has been happening right from the beginning of the conflict with regard to Ukrainians with Russian families, and the fact that the Russian families just don't believe their own family members and are much more likely to believe the Russian media propaganda. And it's really been terribly sad. And this annoyed me at the beginning of the conflict, because it's just like, how can you believe Putin over your own brother or sister? And yet this was happening. I don't know if you guys saw a lot of accounts of these, but this is a really common occurrence right at the beginning of the conflict and right through. Well, this is Anastasia Klimash saying this, and I'll try and read it really quickly. In the first days of the full-scale invasion, I was probably contacted by more people than I knew. And up until today, I'm stunned by the kindness, understanding, and support I get from almost everyone around. Everyone, except my Russian relatives. They never reached out. I left Dnipro after spending 3 weeks with my parents, and for the past 2 nights, the Russian army has been shelling the city. I know it's unreasonable, but I can't help but feel guilty for not being there. Meanwhile, our Russian relatives haven't bothered to contact my family ever since February the 24th. These people visited us before in Ukraine and had our warm welcome. They know perfectly there are no Nazis here, but they don't care about their country waging this unjust war against us. Right now, our family in Ukraine is rather a liability for them. Uncomfortable facts. I repeat, they know everything. My Russian relatives have been watching my Instagram stories about the war since February 24th and remain silent. Some quietly unfollowed me later, including my Russian cousin who lives in Germany. It's not like FSB, so the Russian Secret Services, is breathing over her shoulder there. About 2 years ago, we met with my Russian cousin and her German husband in Copenhagen, visited DAC, ate some quality food, went to a dodgy club, giggled at some weird people there, and had a chat. You know, the usual stuff bored millennials with degrees from European universities do. She's an architect, not a brainwashed dropout, Vanya, from a deprived Russian village with no internet. But even that is nonsense. They all have access to the information. Don't infantilize them. Her husband remains silent too. Speak of the influence of the Russian world, am I right? Her brother in Moscow, who several years ago told my mum, you need to understand, we don't make any decisions here. Also, for a week or so, watched my Instagram stories with photos of buildings obliterated by Russian missiles and unfollowed me, too. My mum was babysitting this guy. My story is not exceptional. Many of my friends facing the same. Their Russian relatives are either silent or teach Ukrainians about what's actually happening in Ukraine. Of course, it's all the fault of the decadent West, or saying, yes, but we'll never know all the truth. Many were surprised by such Russian behavior. Not my family. Back in 2014, while the Russian missiles were flying over my parents' heads in Donbass, my Russian cousin called my mum and screamed at her, telling her she shouldn't say anything bad about Russia. Back then, she studied in France. And her mum, my aunt, phoned as well, telling my mum that our Russian girls are now getting bullied here in France. They are called invaders because of you. Say what? Later, we somehow got back to talking to these people every now and then, almost as if nothing happened, except for when they wanted to visit us. Then we were telling them that Crimea is Ukraine, and if they didn't agree, they were not welcome in Ukraine, and they didn't agree. I'm still not sure why we kept in touch. We, Ukrainians, always were way too patient with Russians. Did our patience and keeping in touch with our Russian relatives despite all their shit help? As you see, nope. It just made things worse. Sometimes a silly thought pops into my head. How will we ever forgive them? But then I remember that nobody is asking us for forgiveness. When foreigners are calling for a dialogue with Russia, I just laugh. We tried it all. If anything, our biggest mistake was being pushovers way too long. Not anymore. Being nice just doesn't work with Russians. Russia has to be defeated. And for this, we need the army of Ukraine. We need to arm Ukraine now, sorry. So that's a really powerful, testimony as to what is happening on the ground with peace. So many Ukrainians have family in Russia, and so many of these families are torn apart, as it seems almost entirely that those Russian family members are siding with their sense of nationalism and with Putin, and believing all the propaganda that they are fed, and not believing their own kith and kin. They're not believing their own sort of family members. It just seems absolutely outrageous. Something else I want to show you, which is this video. So I don't know if you remember down in Mariupol. So Mariupol is this city down on the Azov Sea, off to the side of the Black Sea. And this, at the beginning of the war, was a very costly place for the Russians to occupy, and they had it surrounded, and it shrunk and it shrunk and it shrunk, and eventually the defenders, there were Marines and the Azov battalion, stuck in the Azov-style steelworks, which had 6 floors underneath it because it was designed to withstand a nuclear war. And they were hiding out in there, and there were helicopters flying in secretly, equipment, and taking out injured people until a couple of helicopters were taken down, and then that stopped, and then they were on their own. And there's a kind of heroic story of how they defended it. Well, here's a kind of video diary montage that's again really worth watching. Hang on a second. Let me just get this. Okay.
Братан. Брат.
That looks like phosphorus or incendiary munitions at the end there. That's just a really powerful, emotive, evocative video to show what war is really like, and the terrors of war. You know, we can sit here watching the videos I do and looking at maps, but actually those maps, every single centimeter on a map involves stuff like this happening, and the terrors of war and the heroism of war as well. So I thought that was really powerful. That you can guarantee within 10 years there'll be so many Hollywood films made of the stuff that happened there in Mariupol. The heroism and the terror and the cruelty all mixed in. But that was a pretty evocative bit of film there. So yeah, that was the Avastar. And what was really sad about that is when they eventually surrendered, it was on the understanding that there would be a prisoner swap and they would be let free. And it didn't happen. And in fact, loads of the prisoners were then taken to different prisons, and some of those prisons were blown up in false flag operations, where the Russians blew up the prisons with some of the most prominent members of the Azov regiment in. And it's just like, no, that they should have been prisoner swapped. Now some of them are being prisoner swapped, and there is rumors that they're trying to swap all the prisoners on both sides. But Russians went back on their word. And it reminds me of that back in 2014, Crimea, Donbass, there was the Russians said a whole convoy of people could get out, and then they put down their weapons, I think, and then they shot all the convoy people. And it was like stuff like that is going on still in this conflict. Okay. Another couple of nuggets. So this I don't know. There's something quite amusing and ironic about this, which is an automatic demining vehicle got blown up by a mine. So it didn't quite get it right, and the vehicle went over a mine on its track, not on the bit that does the demining. So that's a demining vehicle running over a mine and not lasting very long. Here is something that's fairly scary. So this is Crimea. So there's still quite a bit of material, it seems, in Crimea. Here is an entire train load of vehicles going over, I think, the Kerch Bridge. So look at all those tanks. Just incredible. Hundreds of tanks and other military vehicles spotted this afternoon on the Kerch Bridge in occupied Crimea. Presumably the defense, maybe offense, in Kherson region, where Ukraine seemed likely to make a forward push in the next week or so. So the idea is that this could be going to reinforce the Kherson front line. As I say, not a lot of movement in Kherson, and it's looking like that could take, an awful long time to liberate the entire region. Final thing I'm going to say, this is a really interesting article from the Military Strategy magazine, The Case for Deception in Operational Success. And this is written by Michael G. Anderson from the US Army. It's talking about how disinformation is really, really important. So in an era dominated in ever-increasing and rapid information saturation, deception in warfare is paradoxically more difficult to achieve and more critical to operational success. So you look at Twitter, that's loads of people in the open source intelligence community shoving out information the whole time. It's very difficult to deceive the opposition because everything's being recorded and there's all this information going on, and so actually you can't deceive people so easily when that deception can be found more easily by just people on the internet and all over. So often military deception is overlooked or outright discounted by many planners, especially Western and commonly United States planners, relegated to the niche specialists or experts. Military deception is commonly developed in the compartmentalized process, limiting its impact on the broader campaign planning rather than a deliberate part and consideration of the entire planning effort, often resulting from its perceived difficulty, its complexity, sensitive nature, but also from its degree of doctrinal emphasis, specifically in the case of the US military. So what he's saying here, just translate that into English, is that it isn't planned into the military doctrine of Western forces, military deception, but he's saying it should be. Right? We should be using military deception far more easily. And you could argue that the whole lightning quick attack in Kharkiv was a case of military deception, which is, we're going to attack in Kherson, we're going to attack in Kherson, we're going to attack in Kherson, we're going to attack in Kherson. Russia gets all of its forces, and well, not all of them, but reinforces loads of its forces, shoves 25,000 people in Kherson, and then the Ukrainians attack up in Kharkiv, as well as in Kherson. And there's no defense here because they attack in the weakest place, because they've done a kind of feint or they've sold them a bit of of deception. Now, this guy is saying this should be in the doctrine of the US and Western forces, as in how we teach people how to fight, because it is in the doctrine of the Soviet armies, as was, and now the Russian armies. Interesting. And I'll just read a little bit at the end. Military deception is highly sought and emphasized in the military doctrine and theory of the US military's primary adversaries. In other words, the Russians love a bit of deception. They love to use that and they utilize it well. A prominent example of this is how the Russian Federation armed forces espouse and prize military deception, placing it among their foundational principles for successful operations, though it was arguably absent in the outbreak of hostilities on February the 22nd in Ukraine, as opposed to other recently military operations. So he said that the Russians use it really effectively. However, they didn't actually use it particularly well at all in this particular campaign, whereas they have in other campaigns, just not this one. So, go figure. military professionals stand to benefit from an increased emphasis and practice of the art of military deception as exemplified through military history theory and a further incorporation into the operational doctrine in the 21st century, with increased exposure in military deception across staff colleges, senior non-commissioned officer courses, and expanded detailed military deception courses for required staff operational plans. He's advocating that they teach very formally military deception, and it should be not just this kind of niche doctrinal approach, but actually it should be a foundational principle within military doctrine of the Western forces. So anyway, that's a pretty interesting article, a big paragraphs though, so I think he needs to break his paragraphs up. but a little bit of writing hinting from myself. Anyway, those are the nuggets I've got for you today, and the extra sort of strategic conversation that is to be had or can be had. I hope that you find that interesting. If not, it's just me and I'm talking to myself. Oh well, it's all happening there. How long will Lyman hold out, considering that the Russians are completely surrounded, and it's all about this bottleneck, but they are getting reinforcements in from the east. It's all about waiting to see the impact of the mobilization forces. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Really do appreciate you guys. Please like, subscribe. You can join, give thanks in any other way, or just watch and put your comments below. I do respond to a lot of comments, but obviously the more comments there are, the fewer I will respond to proportionally. That's how life works. Anyway, thank you. Until next time, goodbye.